Looking back to the very beginning of the Bible, we might recall that the temptation which the serpent gave to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, that in eating of the forbidden fruit, they would become like gods. This concept is central to our own concept of original sin. This idea that part of that sin is that we want to always be greater than or more than. We want to make ourselves gods. As we go a little bit further into the Bible, in the book of Exodus, we see this conflict coming to a head where Pharaoh fancies himself God of all peoples of Egypt, including the people of Israel who have been there for a couple of generations at that point. So the God of Israel has to step in and remind him that he isn't a god, that only God is God. Many centuries later, we see Caesar Augustus also presenting himself as a god among men. And it's within that context that our gospel reading falls. John in this reading is very upfront about who Jesus is. The Word of God, that primal creative force through which all things came into being, that Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And if that doesn't make it clear enough, in the beginning of our reading today, when the Roman soldiers ask for Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus responds, "I am." The divine name which God gave to Moses back in Exodus. And the soldiers respond accordingly to that divine name. They turn and fall on the ground at the name of God. Then they go ahead and arrest him anyway. Because divine name notwithstanding, they don't entirely believe in the divinity of this man they see before them. As Isaiah says in our first reading, no stately bearing to make us look at him, no appearance that would attract us to him, no reason to think that this humble person might have any divinity about him. Spurned and avoided by people, a man of suffering, accustomed to infirmity, Isaiah goes on to say. But he begins this whole reading by saying, "See, my servant shall prosper. He shall be raised high and greatly exalted." Isaiah sets up a little contradiction here for us to wrestle with. He describes the lowest and most miserable servant of humanity, saying that this person is exalted and greatly blessed. St. Paul tells us that we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, because God himself has come down from heaven to suffer in every way that we might suffer, to experience the worst of our human experience. And therein lies the heart of Isaiah's contradiction. None of us enjoys suffering. In general, we'll do whatever we have to avoid it. And there's nothing inherently wrong in that, nothing wrong about wanting to avoid suffering. In some ways, I think our human understanding of prosperity, of power, being exalted by God, is influenced by how we work to avoid suffering in our own lives. We go on the assumption that anyone blessed by God is going to have less suffering. We might assume that power, wealth, and prosperity will mean less suffering. And in many ways, in this world that is true. Especially in our modern world, we have some ability to buy our way out of hardships and difficulties, drought and famine, natural disasters and disease, that people in other parts of the world simply have to live with. We have more resources because we're able to buy our way out of the worst of that kind of suffering. Worldly wealth and power does give us some means to set ourselves above a lot of those problems. There's another variation of that original sin of wanting to make ourselves like gods, wanting to set ourselves above other people. Those who don't suffer as much set themselves above those who do. But Christ comes to us and turns this perception on its head. This messianic prophecy of the suffering servant we see in Isaiah does not give us a king who sets himself above the suffering of his own people. A true king, he tells us, has the strength and the courage to suffer alongside, to suffer with, to even take upon himself the worst suffering that humanity can inflict upon humanity. And it is here at his lowest and most vulnerable point that Christ receives those marks of his kingship. The soldiers dress him in royal purple, they give him a crown, they mock him with royal acclaim, and at his execution, the Roman government affirms his kingship. His crime, Pilate says, was that he was king of the Jews. Our God is a God who exalts the humble. He casts down the mighty from their thrones and lifts up the lowly, as another part of the gospel tells us. And if the story ends here, with Christ's crucifixion and death, we wouldn't be here today. There's nothing to celebrate in the ignominious death of a Jewish preacher 2,000 years ago. But of course, the story doesn't end here. We have one more day in our Easter Triduum celebration. One more chapter to this story. To be continued.